welcome to Women Help Women. UN Sustainable Development Goals do impact women, and we're interested in knowing how we can help. I'm Janet Salmons, and Lynn Wilson is here with me today. We've structured this session as a dialogue, and we hope the discussion will continue, so please feel free to contact us at the emails listed on the side. Lynn?
Thank you so much, Janet. I'm Lynn Wilson, Executive Director and CEO of Sea Trust Institute, a nonprofit research and educational organization. We work all over the world with institutes, with companies, and with countries in engaging in environmental research and education and policy. We assist organizations and countries with creating climate change and environmental adaptation strategies and plans, and we work with them to attain their development goals in line with the Sustainable Development Goals that we're going to talk about today. We've been actively participating in the UN multilateral regime and conferences since 2009 and are part of Rio Plus 20, where in 2012 the Sustainable Development Goals were created. We take students with us to many of these meetings, and I am also a doctoral chair and methodologist, so we work both on the academic and the practical side. Sea Trust Institute is part of the UN Global Compact as a supporter. It's a voluntary commitment to carry out UN goals, and as part of that commitment, together with Vision to Lead, we are beginning this initiative for Women Helping Women, for women's role in the Sustainable Development Goals and how we can help. Janet?
And I'm also interested in research, particularly in developing and exploring emerging online methods to use both for academic research, but also for social science and business studies. I'm also interested in leadership and ethics, particularly in our culturally diverse global world. I have a long-term commitment to teaching and learning, particularly online, and have served as a dissertation chair and methodologist for a number of years. So we both bring these efforts, background, and experience together in our collaborative work. We began focusing on interdisciplinary collaboration by editing this two-volume set together, and now we're continuing in this new initiative. So, Lynn, you've told us a little bit about what Sea Trust does. So, what do we need to know about women and the UN climate meetings going forward?
Well, Janet, the UN climate meetings, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is where we mostly work with climate and environmental change, women didn't have a constituency until the last couple of years. This is the new constituency you see here on the slide. And when we first started working in the group in 2009, it was in the Copenhagen meetings, and there were 40,000 people. And I went as our sole representative, walked into this meeting with an idea. And the idea was that if we could use human health as a determinant of progress towards environmental planning, we might be able to help the outcomes of these negotiations progress in a way that would help communities at the community level and, by extension, women in those communities, because women were not explicitly being addressed at that point. That year, we got 27 people in a room of 40,000 at that conference to talk about health, and most of them were WHO, European NGOs, and we began a very small movement to move health from a footnote on page 7 to a footnote on page 3. In subsequent years, we have been attending these meetings. I've been to now more than a dozen as a speaker and presenter, and we have brought women and women's health issues explicitly into these conversations. With that, we were part of helping get the Women and Gender constituency established by virtue of the fact of highlighting women's issues through health. Now we're not only working here through the UNFCCC meetings, but with women's organizations and ministries for women's affairs in places like Vanuatu, Nigeria, the Isle of Man, and places all over the world to help women become more empowered and become leaders of their own resilience movements. So the message here is that no matter whether you go to a big meeting like this or you're in your own community, there's something that every one of us as women can do to help women.
So, one of our goals here today is to decode some of the kind of technical language. And so perhaps you could start by explaining what we mean by the SDGs.
Certainly, Janet. The SDGs are the Sustainable Development Goals, and they're a set of 17 goals under which we will find 169 targets and indicators. As I said earlier, these were created at Rio Plus 20 in 2012, and it is expected that the UN member states will use these to frame their agendas and policies over the next 15 years in something that's being referred to as the 2030 Agenda. Now, before the SDGs, we had the Millennium Development Goals, and many people say, why do we need new goals? Well, the Millennium Development Goals expired at the end of 2015, and the SDGs are taking their place because the Millennium Development Goals were so specific, such as quantitatively lessen maternal deaths and working with combating HIV, and they didn't address the root causes, like you see on the screen here, of poverty, of gender inequality, the holistic nature of development. So while they did lead to an increase in the numerical representation of women, they paid very little attention to the barriers of women's meaningful participation, like whether women are actually able to influence decisions once they achieve a post, or what happens at the subnational levels and what happens in communities that women have great influence and even control over now. Goal number 5 was about achieving gender inequality, and one of the important things about this is that the women's issues transcend goal number 5. They go throughout every single one of these goals, and we're going to show you a little bit about how that happens tonight. When the SDGs were agreed upon in 2015 in Paris, they were part of the Paris Agreement that was signed on Earth Day, April 22nd of this year. There's one other element that you need to understand about it, and that's the financing element. And in 2015 in July, there was a conference in Addis Ababa in which the multi-development world and the finance world agreed to significantly finance the Sustainable Development Goals that go into effect in 2020 and will be up for monitoring in 2030, as this is considered the 2013 Agenda. And the last of the decoding comes through the INDCs. The countries came up with their intended national determined contributions. And this is what they think they're going to be able to do about these various goals. Right now, there are meetings going on in Bonn, Germany, which are for the intersessional of these year-end meetings like the ones we just had in Paris. And they're translating the countries' intended goals into their national determination goals, the NDCs, so that they have a little bit more force of happening, and they can put to that some monitoring and evaluation points still to be determined. So obviously the next milestone is transforming these pledges, which is what they are, voluntary pledges, into actionable, practical, and bankable plans. So that's where we are with the Sustainable Development Goals. This is a roadmap for those plans. Janet? I'd like to ask you a question. Now that I've given the Reader's Digest condensed version of all things SDG, what strikes you about these goals?
Well, when I started to read about these goals when the meeting in Paris was taking place, one of the things that struck me was, as just a concerned citizen who's not a climate scientist, not immersed in this field, the whole issue around climate change has just seemed so overwhelming. It's so big and it's so complex, and there's so many formidable obstacles keeping us from making the really significant changes that need to be made to combat climate change and all of the kinds of issues that you pointed out. As an individual, you just feel like, this is just, beyond me. What can I really do? And so, you really just feel powerless to do more than, the small changes to your own lifestyle. But I think, the second thing that struck me about these goals was, in some ways, kind of echoing that, how far-reaching they are. I mean, how they infuse into all areas of life. So the culture, the society, the ways that we work, education, all kinds of dimensions were involved. But with the specificity of these goals and targets, it made me feel like, well, hey, maybe there is something that I can do. Maybe there is a contribution I can make to meeting these particular targets that will all add up into this larger effort. So in some ways, I felt that it helped to take this very, very large global set of problems and put it into something that we can really move towards addressing. So when Lynn and I together sat down and looked through all of these goals and the targets that go along with them, three themes that jumped out to us, particularly around the issues for women and girls. First, we were just struck by the fact that gender, more generally, and issues of women and girls were included and named in almost every target. So, within all of this big set of materials, we identified the first theme as access to education and training, the second as preparation for sustainable jobs in a changing world, and the third was the need to build inclusive societies where women and girls really have a chance. So, Lynn, maybe you could start by talking about what the SDGs say about education for women and girls.
Certainly, Janet. The SDGs weave in education throughout all of them, and many of the goals under them and the targets, just as Janet was saying. Because without education, women and girls can't meaningfully participate, whether it is at an agricultural level with what to plant for climate-smart agriculture, or whether it is getting educated so that they can have a policy voice on things that are meaningful to their country in a health issue, in just their whole society as they relate to these various goals, like goal number 3, ensure healthy lives, or number 8, promoting economic growth and decent work. In many of the developing countries of the world, women have no land tenure. They can't own land. This has created a huge problem with them being able to promote their own economic growth and development. Some of this is cultural, some of this is political, but it is all interwoven with education in terms of getting not only the women themselves, but the governmental entities to understand that it is in their own best economic and social best interest to elevate the level of women and girls. So one of the ways we've done this at Sea Trust is through our AWARE family of programs. This is called Action Within a Resilient Environment, and these are education programs that start at the high school level. We have a high school program for students to go through a 4-week online course with us, with our environmental educators, to learn the climate science, the social science, and the health issues that impact them, because they're going to gauge their responses to the decisions they make for a preferable future based upon health. They then do a project that we approve in their community and video record that for community service credits to graduate. From that sprung AWARE Academy, which is a cost-free program for all teachers of students ages 5 to 13, based on the same premises but age-appropriate. And then it expanded into AWARE Business and Industry so that we could help corporate social responsibility groups through various sizes of business find ways that they could not only have the knowledge, but work within their community or within the communities in which we're in their whole network, whether they're suppliers or customers or places they have employees. We have an AWARE government so that we can work with government entities to be part of the same solution. And finally, which we'll talk about a little more in a minute, we have some country-specific programs that deal with the issues and the science specific to a given country, as you see in this case, Kenya. Now, all of these are ways to help support the achievement of the SDGs, as well as train for environmental adaptation and climate change. When we were in Paris, we were quite surprised, we had a booth there at the COP21, at the number of ambassadors and negotiators that came up to our booth and said, education is something we can get behind and will help us immediately show success towards our SDGs. A lot of the global funding in the world is tied to whether or not governments are making incremental progress on their sustainable development goals. And education, interestingly enough, proved to be one of the most cross-cutting ways in which they could see immediate return. So, Janet, what do you think the SDGs have to say about training and skills for women and girls? Training and skills is related to education. Training and skills isn't quite the same thing.
Right, Lynn, because while the kinds of programs that you described for the school-age children and even at the university level are absolutely critical for preparing the next generation, we have a lot of people who are out in the workforce today and are finding themselves displaced because the climate is changing and the whole economy is changing around it. So as we look through all of the targets listed under the Sustainable Development Goals, we find a number of points around the needs for new skills to be able to function in this new environment. And I've listed just a few of them here. I thought it was particularly interesting to see that, for example, with the first one, we have a need to, be able to use technology, but not only, for, kind of its own value or even only for workplace skills, but also to promote women's empowerment. They're also listed, a number of areas where women need new understandings in, say, financial services and markets so that they can, learn how to get the resources they need to make perhaps, changes in their work and their careers. And then I was also pleased to see that family planning and knowledge about reproductive health were included in this area. So in looking through these and other goals, it seemed like the themes that jumped out to me were the access and ability to use technology, the knowledge about financing and market, and skills not only for jobs, but also for entrepreneurship, which we'll discuss in a moment, and the knowledge about health, not only about reproductive health, but health issues. Then finally, looking at, all of these issues in a broader context of society and culture. So in thinking about all of these topics, certainly we have, global issues, but, here in the United States, we have our own challenges to overcome. So I wanted to share this example from the Oregon tradeswomen who are training women not only to go into non-traditional construction-oriented jobs, but also to bring an environmental focus, into their work. They infuse all of their programs with kind of a green building mentality, but they also have a specific apprenticeship program in environmental training that helps women prepare for new kinds of jobs in wind and solar and recycling and other kinds of areas. I was pleased to see that this program, just as the SDGs have this very, kind of broad focus, so this particular program also draws the participants' attention to the need to develop leadership skills to find and become mentors. So I thought this was a really good example of a program that is, really taking some forward steps to meet the SDGs here in the U.S.
And back to another international example, I mentioned earlier that our AWARE programs had country-specific programs. Well, this is one we're starting in Kenya. In fact, our first pilot is due to start right away with 5 counties, including Nairobi City and surrounding counties this fall. And the difference in this and the standard AWARE education program is that this is directly tied to the issues that these people are facing in their community, and it is also skills training. Because part of it, you will see our Kenyan young lady at the bottom, Jennifer Mwangi, who has been with us for several years, is returning home to run this program from her grandmother's farm, and that's her grandmother and sister in the picture. And what she'll be doing in part is training young women just a little bit older than the high school students to do our program and to work with the students on very specific issues. Nairobi and all of Kenya has been suffering for the second year back-to-back of extensive floods. The flooding continues right now to knock out their infrastructure, their internet systems. Many things are having to be postponed. Many towns and neighborhoods you can't even get to. People have been without electricity now for several weeks. And this has become a very well recognized problem. So water, and in particular dealing with floods and getting fresh water after the flood and so forth. And then, of course, in the dry season, they have severe droughts in Kenya. So they have these very, very large climate swings that are becoming more and more the norm. And so we will be engaging in training this group of women to be able to go into the schools in their community and to continue our programs on the very specific and issues that are pertinent to that area at this time, with the most current global science, the local observations and knowledge, and applying it to the real issues that are pertinent at the moment to help these young women become leaders in their community. So, Janet, in addition to education and training, how do the things that we have been talking about relate to jobs, and in particularly to entrepreneurship?
Entrepreneurship is mentioned throughout the Sustainable Development Goals because with the changing economy, there are sometimes needs that can be addressed at the local level. We need at all levels creativity and innovation to come up with new ways of solving our problems, as well as new ways to open up employment and offer decent work for everyone. So when we think about entrepreneurship, one of the points that was made in the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor report that came out recently is that with climate change and all that is bringing to many communities, the problems that are arising are quite difficult, and sometimes the entrepreneurs at the local level can come up with solutions that will meet those needs, and then at the same time create kind of a income stream, for individuals or groups of individuals in those communities who are starting new businesses or new NGOs or other kinds of entities. And, as we're thinking about, this kind of entrepreneurship, it takes, a slightly different focus than kind of, what we think of generally with entrepreneurial activities. And, again, may include both social entrepreneurship and more business-oriented entrepreneurship. But in either case, there is a fundamental commitment to the environment and, being able to adapt to the evolving nature of the green economy. So in this particular report from the Women's Bureau at the U.S. Department of Labor, they promoted the opportunities these kinds of commitments give for women in particular. And while, we really need those entrepreneurs to come up with new businesses and new organizations, we also need our corporations and big companies to get involved. And certainly they are getting involved. And we have, what's commonly called a corporate social responsibility, or another acronym, CSR, that, just is defined here. And I think, as time goes on, the expectation is that corporate social responsibility is not just something nice to do, but it's really a part of doing business. And, it is, it adds to productivity, and it certainly, contributes to the bottom line. So, this is something that people in the business world increasingly have to, kind of calculate into the ways that they operate at all levels. Now, here's a diagram from one tech company, Unibet, that describes the way that they approach CSR, both internally, in their own organization of creating great places and fair places to work, but also moving out into the things they can do in their communities and then globally. So companies certainly are stepping up and getting involved and have been at the table to think about the sustainable development goals, and this extends a lot farther from simply giving money or being charitable towards these activities, but really to contribute expertise. And I just posted a few examples here, but I think that this first one illustrates the ways that all of the points that I've mentioned here kind of fit together. We saw in the Oregon example the importance of training women for new kinds of jobs and new kinds of opportunities, and here, looking at ways that corporations can contribute their expertise to help entrepreneurs at the local level get not only the skills that they need, but also the financing they need to get those businesses off the ground. This point about expertise is kind of woven throughout. We need to know how to operate differently, and that might mean, how to operate as an independent business versus, waiting, applying for a job somewhere. One of the points that was made in that global entrepreneurship report, which is a big global kind of ongoing study and collection of data, they pointed to the need to include this kind of expertise and exposure to entrepreneurship opportunities and corporate social responsibility from the point of elementary school. So, we need to, tie these ideas back into both education and training. So, Lynn, maybe, as we look at, how these different ideas are interconnected, you could talk a little bit about the societal and cultural factors.
Certainly, Janet. I think that everything she just said about the CSR and the fact that anyone working in sustainability is dealing with the triple bottom line of economic, social, and environmental issues. That wheel she showed clearly delineated those three areas in CSR. And again, it's all about inclusion. It's about inclusive of business, including different people in different societies, including women and girls, and specifically across all of these goals and targets. You'll see a list here again, and I won't go through each one of them, because I think you probably are beginning to see a pattern here, that all of the things we're talking about and the things that jumped out at us, education and training, inclusion, corporate social responsibility, all of these things are woven throughout every one of these goals. And the work with the goals is to show that it's not a standalone effort, that each one of these goals and everything that anyone does, whether they're a country or a company or an individual that signs on to work on these goals, has an impact on every single aspect of sustainable development, and therefore global resilience to all kinds of change, social change and environmental change. So I think that's what's so very important here, is the pattern that we're seeing. So we've talked a lot about what the SDGs are and what we see in them. So perhaps now that we've done the what, we need to think about how. So it's not just the implications, it's what does it mean to you? How are we going to actually work with the SDGs? On the left-hand box on this screen, you'll see some very timely information from the Overseas Development Institute from a report they just released entitled The Power to Decide, Women, Decision-Making, and Gender Equality. And they're looking at issues around women's participation and leadership and projecting what it could mean in the short and the medium and the long term. In the short term, they're really focusing on Target 5.5 with gender and development, getting women to have more ability to influence what goes on and more representation in politics and policy at multiple levels, and stronger links with women's organizations. In the medium term, which is 2 to 10 years, remembering that in 10 years is the first basically we're looking at the first look at how far along we are with the SDGs. They're actually thinking that women's organizations may be able to put together innovative political apprenticeship programs, which of course is very much linked to Janet's example for training, which had to do with the U.S. Department of Labor, which has one of the foremost global apprenticeship models, and they even have apprenticeships all over the world. And through this apprenticeship development model, the goal is to get women in at least 30% of national and local governmental representations around the world, to chair committees, to have gender advisors as commonplace, and that therefore in 10 years the goal projected would be to have women's priorities and needs reflected in the policies and services at all levels and be quite tangible in terms of the positive impacts that can be measured across their lives and across the lives of the communities. So while this is a bit of a projection of what we would like to see in a preferable world, we took a little look at this and said, well, there's some things that have to happen in order for that preferable world to occur in 3 realms: economic, social, and environmental. The first one is integration. The beauty of the 2030 Agenda is that it is an integrated approach, that all of these goals impact every other one and they work together. The World Bank and other development banks and organizations have subscribed to this and have pledged money starting in 2020 to help make this happen, as I said earlier, because they understand that these 3 realms are interconnected. Without a healthy economy, you have high unemployment, and that leads to a host of its own social problems. And without a healthy economy, governments can't have the revenues they need to handle the social ills. And without a healthy environment, we deplete the resources upon which that economy and the society depends. And that contributes to human illness, displacement, militaristic action, devolution of governments, all sorts of things. So without a vibrant community, we don't have the employees to work in the businesses. The people in crisis do not have the luxury of being concerned about environmental degradation. We see that now in some of the countries most affected by climate change. They're worried about survival. And so they just don't have the ability to be concerned about some of the larger scale issues. If we don't understand the interdependencies, we often make poor decisions even with good intentions. So we tend to focus on one realm over the other. So this whole business of integration is absolutely essential. Second, we need to make good economic sense. And I think that's mirrored in what Janet was talking about in involving the private sector. In Paris, the discussion was that business had to be persuaded with the right kinds of arguments and incentives, and that's what this global McKinsey Institute report was all about, saying that if we did that, that global economy stands to gain up to $28 trillion in the next year, U.S., providing governments and private sector with solid cases for investment in the SDGs. Well, that's true, but we're seeing that businesses want to step up. I think the era of arguments and incentives is giving way to what Janet so appropriately showed you, that is, it's good business. It's just good business to work to create sustainable development all over the world. And finally, the goals don't mean much if they're not tracked, measured, and financed. So the World Bank's Global Partnership for Social Accountability in January talked about monitoring the SDGs as the one knot we have not tied. And interestingly enough, they identified civil society as the organization, the groups that should take the role in monitoring the SDGs as an impartial outside party. SDGs 16 and 17 are actually the linchpins for monitoring and evaluation of all of the SDGs. And they're critical if we're going to see this surpass what the MDGs were, which were a good idea and nice intentions, into really actionable items. So I think that has a lot to say about the how. And remembering the role of the private sector in this is that they account for 90% of the jobs in developing countries. Foreign investment absolutely dwarfs development assistance. And this again points to the business community's role in the SDGs as absolutely critical. So, Janet.
So what are we going to do? Lynn and I have joined forces, and we're hoping that we can offer sessions like this, as well as more in-depth training or consulting with companies or organizations about how to understand these complex ideas and translate them into actionable steps they can take. We are hoping to convene a meeting about women and the Sustainable Development Goals in 2017. So please contact us. We hope that we will hear from you and look forward to hearing about the projects you're doing and any questions you might have about the Sustainable Development Goals and your own participation to make the world a better place.